So this is now the third section, and magically this graph has appeared. So what we're going to be doing in this section is to kind of put supply and demand together. And more importantly, one of the issues which I kind of encountered with you guys is that you guys don't really quite get how we get to this particular equilibrium point. So before I kind of start with that particular discussion, there are a few things. The first thing that you need to be familiar with is obviously that the demand curve is downward sloping and the supply curve is upward sloping. That's the first thing. The second thing is be aware that what we have here is also a thing called producer and consumer surplus, and that will be something I'll be talking a little bit about in the sort of later bits of this discussion. So that's basically what this is about. This particular section will focus on how we actually get here. So let's start with this particular market. So this is, let's call this a market for, I don't know, let's call it for shoes or something, just something quite plain. I'm not a very creative guy. So again, let's think about this a little bit. So suppose that the price is at $6, okay? So at a price of $6, we know that buyer one would be willing to pay $6, okay? They're happy to pay $6. Is there a supplier that's willing to supply at a price of $6? Oh yeah, absolutely. Supplier one, his marginal cost, hopefully you also understand why the supply curve reflects the marginal cost, is basically $1. So of course he'd be willing to supply to buyer one. But then let's think about this, okay? As seller two, would he be willing to supply the shoes at $6? Of course he is, but of course we've applied the rationing rule so that buyer one is the first person that gets to buy first. So seller two, being the sneaky person that he is, will say, well, you know what? Even if I were to sell it at $5, okay, I would still be making a profit. I mean, my marginal cost is only $2. Compare that to 5, I'll sell it at 5. So then in the next round, then buyer one will say, oh wow, okay, it's now $5. So I'm going to go to seller two. Okay, so in other words, seller one has basically lost his business. So then what would he do? He would then say, okay, since I lost my business, will I be making money at $5? Of course I would. So let's drop it down to $5. Buyer two is of course the second buyer that would be willing to buy at a price of 5. So then he would then go to seller 1. So then seller 3 is saying, thinking, okay, $5, I'm still actually kind of making a profit, okay? What if I drop it to basically $4? Well, if you drop it to $4, okay, then seller 3 will say, I'm willing to sell it at 4. What's basically going to happen? Buyer 1 will then go to seller 3. Okay. Buyer 2 will stick to seller 1, right, as he always has. And now seller 2 has said, hey, I've just lost my business, right? And he's not very, very happy. So then he'll drop to $4. And if he drops to $4, you can kind of see where this is going. He's basically then going to steal buyer 2 from seller 1, and then what would happen is everyone will then converge to the price of $3, right? That's effectively what is happening here as to how we actually converge towards that equilibrium. And you can understand, hopefully you can intuitively see why you can't go to any other price here. There's no point of deviation, because if the price were at 4, then one of these sellers, seller 1, seller 2, seller 3, would be willing to actually drop their prices to gain that particular consumer, right? Because there is some incentive for them to do that. If the price was too high, seller 4, of course, would then be willing to supply, but he'll never actually get that business because buyer 4, right, is only willing to pay $2 for that particular good. So this comes to the point of what we call equilibrium, where we have exactly the quantity sold equal to the quantity demanded, right? So this is what equilibrium is. It's the point where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity sold. We don't have any excess demand, nor do we have any excess supply, Okay, so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about equilibrium. The next thing to touch upon is to talk a little bit about consumer and producer surplus. Okay, so what is consumer surplus? Well, think about what surplus is. It's that excess, right? So from the consumer's perspective, right, what we have is that for buyer one, right, his willingness to pay is $6. That's also what we call his reservation price. But what is the actual price he pays, right? Well, the actual price he pays in equilibrium is $3. So in other words, this difference between 6 and 3 represents consumer surplus. How about for the producers? Well, for the producers, right, think about seller one. Okay, his marginal cost is really just $1, but he's managed to sell it at $3, hasn't he? So this is what we also call producer surplus. So that's basically the idea, right? And in a perfectly competitive market, what you will also notice is that in equilibrium itself, right, the surplus, total economic surplus, that is the sum of consumer, producer, and potentially government revenue, will always be maximized at equilibrium. So that is another thing to really understand. That is what is producer surplus, what is consumer surplus, and hopefully now it should all be relatively clear as to now how you can actually converge towards this beautiful point called equilibrium. And it's a very important result.